Have you ever come across that one game that you had low expectations of and were only playing to kill some time? The reviews were average, the popularity marginal, and you go in expecting a subpar experience. But then something magical happens. And after many hours of gameplay, the realization that this was one of the best games you have ever played hits you like a ton of bricks. That was my personal story regarding Mad Max 2015. If you go into Google and type in Mad Max, the only thing that pops up is links and articles about Mad Max Fury Road, which was directed by George Miller and was a critical and commercial success. But little does anybody know of a game from the same franchise that came out in the same year as the movie did. In fact, me coming across the game itself was entirely accidental, as it seems to have gone into incognito mode in the gaming world. When I was doing my research on Just Cause 4, I suddenly saw a game named Mad Max. And since I had watched the movie and absolutely loved it, I was intrigued by the game. But at the same time, I was also shocked that a game on the Road Warrior exists and I had never even heard of it. So naturally I assumed it was bad, hence the lack of publicity, but decided to read up a little more on it as I didn't want to taint my unparalleled experience with the movie. And when I saw the critics' reviews on Wikipedia, who gave the game an average rating, I thought to myself, obviously. But then when I went back to the Google page, I noticed that it had some seriously high ratings in Google user reviews and Steam, where it cost a mere $20. At which point I surmised, why not? And just bought the game as a Christmas present to myself. And even before we get into the nitty-gritty of this review, I'd like to tell you that the $20 they're charging for this masterpiece is an insult. I'd strongly suggest you go buy and play it, because this could be one of the top 5 games of 2015. And here which saw powerhouses like The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, Batman Arkham Knight, and Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain be released. But unlike the aforementioned games, Mad Max didn't receive the love and admiration it deserved. Before I go any further, I want you all to understand that this is a highly subjective opinion, as the game's pacing and tonality will probably not appeal to many people who just want a high-octane, quick shot of dopamine brainless experience, which Mad Max does not provide. So even if you don't agree with my assessment on the subject, I'd appreciate if nobody gets needlessly aggressive in the comments section. If you feel a different way, let's have a conversation like gentlemen. For those who are new to the channel, I like speaking about how the first hour makes me feel, as that is usually the make or break period for any game for me. And Mad Max's introduction sequence was outright terrifying. It gives us a brief look at the events that made his world a desolate wasteland that's on the edge of being inhabitable. And since I had already watched the movie, which is outstanding, the bar was set pretty high. But the action, the world building, character designs, and most importantly, a sense of mystique surrounding not just Max, but the entire wasteland made me ever so invested within the first 30 minutes in fact. And to be honest, it superseded the movie in most regards. The whole point of attraction towards this franchise is the idea of visiting a world that's been destroyed by none other than the actions of humans. A place where men are little more than instinctive creatures, where only the most savage can even have a slight chance of survival, and the more barbaric one is, the more powerful they are. And this game captured that idea better than any medium before this. There are 3 main pillars that form the crux of this game: the world, the characters, and story. So let's start with the world, because this aspect is the single greatest achievement on the developers' part and the biggest strength of the game. So before I talk about anything else, I need to cover how the world of Max is modeled. The main theme of Mad Max is scarcity and desperation. In 99% of the games, like GTA, Call of Duty, or even Assassin's Creed, restocks are in an endless supply, be it health or ammunition. But rarely a game comes around that not only makes you fight tooth and nail for it, but also dawns upon you the value of it. One more such game that comes to mind is Resident Evil 2 Remake. I remember how I would be scared for my life, as I usually ended up in situations where I had 1 bullet against 10 zombies. But speaking of Mad Max, never before has a game made scarcity feel so powerful and ironically abundant. Every drop of water, every shotgun shell, a single morsel of food, it's all just so difficult to find. And the few who haven't turned into cannibals are eating maggots and canned dog food to survive. It's a little yet impactful detail which speaks volumes about how terrible life is here. The game was marketed as an action adventure, but what it truly is at its very core is a survival horror. Throughout the entire run of the game, the vastness and emptiness of the wasteland gave me goosebumps. Because not only did it all feel disturbingly authentic, but the way they've made it feel so ruthless and violent just made it a terrifyingly stupendous experience. The world is a massive unknown amount of square kilometers, as distance and time are of no consequence in the game. The base map consists of 18 different territories, and every region has its own distinct quality. Like some places have rocky mountainous terrain, for example the Chalkies. Some are just oceans of sand like the Underdunes and the Dry Gusty. And there are also oil extraction grounds where we see spilled over crude or dumping yards full of garbage and metal junk, which happens to be the baddest territory in the wasteland, the dump, which is also where the spine-chilling gas town is housed in all its suffocating glory. The place is colossal and full of humongous industrial chimneys that ooze fire and smoke 24/7, which makes it visible from I'd say 90% of the map. And as if the world is not dangerous and frightening enough, there are minefields, massive beacons of metal and fire called scarecrows, and random sniper tasks, in addition to an infinite number of patrol vehicles that roam the land all the time that belong to the primary antagonist, who's put together an army in order to keep his enemies scared and at bay. The original design was apparently much bigger, which sounds crazy as it's an already massive map. But once you cross the border of the known world and venture into the big nothing, you can go on forever. And I know that most of you think it's an exaggeration, but theoretically you can drive for hours and still keep going until your fuel runs out. Speaking of fuel, this along with scrap is the basic form of currency here. Everything in this post-apocalyptic desert land is about cars, guns, and more cars. Which might sound boring, but on the contrary is this world's most fascinating aspect. The way most wastelanders are so passionate about V8 engines, massive explosions, and gasoline as they put it, tells us so much about them and makes perfect sense. If you look at it from a 2023 modern day social media heavy abundance of resources on Earth perspective, you might think why anybody would want to pierce themselves like this or die for some racing glory. But we gotta understand that these men and women were born into this dystopian world and they know nothing else. Society here is non-existent, and so are the foundations that make us human. It's been established throughout history that men, when they have nothing left, resort to unspeakable levels of malevolence. And as much as Max tries to outrun this violent cycle, he ends up going back to his ruthless, murderous self, which ironically makes him just like everyone else, but also different, as he's probably one of the only men whose humanity is hanging by a thread to whatever is left of his soul. What a horrifying life to live. The amazing part is that this world exists almost free of a past and without a future. What do I mean by that? They've given us a 45-second explanation as to what happened, which vaguely points to a nuclear apocalypse along with diseases and massive climate change, which drained the oceans and almost killed humanity. And there are also trinkets from the past, like old toned-down bridges, small abandoned towns, and a handful of other half-demolished buildings, along with an airport that's almost completely submerged under sand that people are now using for shelter. There are also pictures of random people which point out that once, long ago, humanity was still around. And every time Max comes across a photo, he briefly speaks of what men lost, which in hindsight was really touching. It also gave the game a philosophical side, which tells us the error of our ways and how we've taken all that we have for granted. More often than not, games are barely one thing, like an action adventure, a first-person shooter, or an RPG. But the post-apocalyptic dystopian setting is one that can be many things with a myriad of layers in each aspect without having to be focused in just one direction, which is a strength if exercised properly. And boy, did they do just that, or what. And going back to my original point where I said the past and future doesn't matter here because time is just irrelevant. Surviving is the only thing that matters. You're alive and kicking until you're not, and everything in this world is out to get you, from the people around to the wasteland itself. Everything. Also, there's almost no animals around except for one. Just some random reptiles here and there, presumably because all of them were butchered for food long ago. and the population consists of 8 factions. The most unhinged are Scrotus's warboys and the outright crazy buzzards. The more civil groups ride under the banner of Pink Eye, Gutgash, Jeet and Deep Freer. And then there's the maniacal roadkill faction that occupy most of the scavenging locations, and the helpless and hopeless wastelanders that belong to no faction and are just wandering the desert looking for food and water, trying to survive. Speaking of the blue, water is one resource that's probably the most scarce in this wasteland, as you can barely find a glass or two here and there. And many a times you'd find yourself going miles to get half or even quarter of a bottle. And another way the Wastelanders' whole obsession with cars and fuel made sense was because this world is already lost. All that's left is a barren, never-ending hell. So it's not like people can focus on growing trees or rehabilitating the earth. They're going with what could be their last defiant act before being extinct. All the pointers indicate that most of the places they are now inhabiting was once a part of the ocean, as there's massive bridges, ships and even a lighthouse around. But the way it all generates fear even in broad daylight is a first ever experience for me, because there's a serious lack of resources, as I pointed out earlier. So you keep looking over your shoulders all the time for drivers from enemy clans, hungry wastelanders who would gladly have you for lunch, and other unknown dangers that lurk around in this treacherous desert. The previously mentioned civil clans of Jeet, Pink Eye, Gutgash and Deep Freer offer Max a stronghold where he can rest, upgrade his car, restock on ammunition and resources. But these places offered something greater for me, as they were the only locations where I could sense some semblance of humanity still remaining. So it in turn gave a sense of security and peace, which I can tell you from my experience was an extremely short supply in Max's world. And another vital part of this society are camps, which are basically enemy strongholds where oil is pumped out, filtered, and some camps house area leaders called top dogs, who are like mini bosses that Max has to take out in order to lower the threat in said territory. And these camps are filled with half-eaten dead bodies and the carcasses of tortured human beings, which I gotta say was disturbing. It definitely isn't for the faint of heart. There's also a ton of hidden locations, as you would expect in such a place, that have all sorts of surprises, from historic relics to creatures that want to murder you for food and fun. The game also has a weather system, which I reckon was the precursor to Just Cause 4's Apex game engine, as it simulates terrifying yet beautiful sandstorms, which last way longer than what I expected. And the storm also carries flying objects with it, as it should, causing damage to Max and his car, the magnum opus, forcing the players to take shelter. The creators have put heavy emphasis on realism and logic, which I absolutely loved. But now it's time to address some of the criticisms regarding the world. Some reviewers have called the world bland, identical and repetitive. I don't mean to disrespect these people, but what kind of logic do these people incorporate while making such statements? Because it's not like there are a few locations, it's well within the 300 to 400 range. There's a lot of variety and each location is unique and feels fresh. So they can't mean those things. And in case they didn't notice, it's a goddamn wasteland. So it's supposed to be bland and practically dead. So what on God's green earth are these people on about? I feel games like Mad Max were brought down by such mindless, shallow critics who clearly don't understand or connect to the world and are basically passing judgments without any concrete reasoning. Some people also considered Max's voice acting inconsistent. I don't know which game they were playing, but the man hardly spoke. And when he did, he got straight to the point. So that's one more stupid statement that went completely over my head. I understand that each person has his or her own perspective, and I respect it when people call out bullshit openly. But when they judge a product without understanding or deep diving into its history and lore, which in turn brings down once-in-a-lifetime games like Mad Max, it pisses me off. I say it again, it's an outright tragedy that this game wasn't a bestseller or a Game of the Year contender, because it deserved to at least be nominated. Let's go over to the characters and designs now. Once the game was through, I was in a haze. I could not stop thinking about Max and all the other characters I came across for nearly a week. because they were just so beautifully written and developed throughout the game, it almost brought me to tears when the plot ended. First, there's Max, the road warrior, the ultimate killing machine and a crazed survivalist. And our anti-hero looks exactly how I'd expect him to. Raw, tough, and an absolute soldier who's trying to fight one battle at a time. A few tiny details made him seem all the more tough and reckless. Like after a fight, Max would have a bloody nose or bleeding lips, but the man doesn't even wipe it off. He just carries on. And it shows us how nothing matters in this world, big, small, or otherwise. Max's character development came more through actions than words, which is extraordinary. It's so rare. As I said before, he barely speaks, but all throughout the game, you see him going out of his way to help others, like offering water to thirsty wastelanders and helping ally clans build food and water storage units to improve living conditions, which in turn would allow the strongholds to house more individuals, going into danger zones to rescue people he barely knows or people that have outright betrayed him, showing compassion or even restraint from killing, and even risking his own neck at times for what's right, which showed us how despite all that he's faced, there's still humanity left in this monster. You might be wondering why I called him that. It's because although he's good, there is a deeply disturbed, violent, and vengeful side to him, which clearly is the fuel that keeps him going. The idea of channeling one's rage and sorrow into everlasting motivation has rarely been put on screen better. Then there's Chumbucket, who's Max's ally, mechanic, and incessant travel companion, who tags along in the early stages but later becomes almost a friend. A hunchback who's also psychologically deformed V8 zealot, who wears a necklace made of spark plugs, which I thought was a really nice detail. It tells us that a man from this desolate world would rather have engine parts on him than something critical such as clothes. Chum does most of the speaking during the game, and as time progresses, he becomes probably the most intriguing character among the lot. Shockingly, even more so than Max himself. Mostly because he represents the quintessential wastelander, demented, disfigured, and ready to die for a can of fuel. So he's the embodiment of what the future holds. Whereas Max, on the other hand, is a man from the past, still a bit human, still a bit sane, mourning what he lost. So these contrasting personalities made for a deeply unsettling and thought-provoking pair that sheds light on as many facets as it makes you question. This Blackfinger's obsession with the magnum opus makes him a constant threat, as you keep wondering throughout the game what his real intentions are and speculating when he would turn against you. But his writing, story, and especially his voice acting is unforgettable. Basically, he's a man who formerly worked for the primary antagonist Scabrous Scrotus as his mechanic, but after a bizarre dream became obsessed with building a vehicle of godly speed, but was given a death sentence by Scrotus as Chum started stealing parts for his dream car, the Magnum Opus. And after seeing Max fight and nearly kill Scrotus, Chumbucket is convinced that he is the right person to join forces with to fulfill his divine calling. Those crazed eyes, his voice that oozes joy at the sight of the Magnum Opus, and his constant prioritizing of machine over human life all made him ever so fascinating. Scabrous Scrotus, who's the main villain, is a force to be reckoned with. The third son of Immortan Joe, the primary antagonist of Mad Max Fury Road, who's also an absolute unit. His appearances are few and far between, but every time he comes on screen, he brings a sense of terror with him. But then again, he's a 7-foot-something mountain of muscle, with his teeth filed and sharpened to fangs, a couple of rotting skulls attached to the back of his neck, a disturbing horn strapped to his crotch area, and some serious brain damage. He's also presumably ill, as he always has a breather on. And it's not even just his character design. They've put in some instances where he survives that which would kill any other man to give him the ultimate boss feel. Then there's Hope, who was introduced in the most random of ways, who later turned into a mind-blowing principal character. Hope is little more than a prize in this unholy hell given to the man or woman who can win the big race in Gastown. The concubine is to Max exactly what her name means: hope. Probably the last bit of it in his life, who's fighting with everything she has to keep her daughter safe, who's named Glory. She's another one of the very few people who are still somewhat human and have something real to live for. Now about the 4 ally clan leaders who all believe different things. For instance, Jeet just wants to improve his artillery and current living conditions. pink guy who's named so because her irises are pink, is on a mission to find new and possibly habitable zones for the younger generation that's still around. Cutgash and his people believe that the water would one day return, so they are trying to repair and ready their fortress, which is an abandoned ship for the day the oceans fill these lands once again. His name essentially means a man with a large wound on his stomach, which is presumably from way back. Then there's Deep Freer, who's a cult leader who's trying to deliver his disciples from their sins and into the great flame. Freer is burned badly with scar tissue covering most of his body, and the way mission designs are intertwined with these backstories and personal objectives of these clan leaders was perfect. Because not only does it further and add context to the plot, it also makes you explore regions that you'd probably dread stepping foot in otherwise. Another important side character was Stangum, the deformed general of Scrotus, who's also the champion of Gastown race and in turn practically owns Hope. There's also Crodazzle, a minor but intriguing side character that appears throughout the events of the game. He's an independent race organizer who's almost revered through these wastelands for his passion for fast cars and death races. His design was particularly fascinating as he seems a conventional man, as in he has no abnormalities or deformities, but he kind of dresses up like a crow god or something. And last but certainly not the least, Griffer, who's an old mysterious man who imparts sagacity onto Max and also allows him to upgrade his abilities. I went all around the internet to know more about Griffer, as very little is disclosed often throughout the game. I really couldn't find much, but for what it's worth, I don't think he even existed for real. Like many out there, I too believe he was only in Max's head, as he seems to go in and out of places undetected and does not interact with anybody other than the road warrior himself. I saw a comment on a thread regarding the strange wise man that Griffer means nothing but grief, which refers to Max's deep-rooted sorrow and agony, which the comment speculated has conjured up a mental projection of a man who embodies said suffering, aka Griffer. I couldn't find the comment despite my repeated tries, but shout out to our unknown voice of logic. All these characters, their names and designs give the whole world an enigmatic and mystical feel. It's almost like this post-apocalyptic world and its people have transcended the norms of humanity and ventured into a sort of metaphysical plane, and I absolutely loved it. Before I dissect the plot and shed light on the positives and negatives, there are a few things I'd like to point out. One, there is zero comedy or humor in this game, which I thought was perfect for the setting. The world has ended here and living is now worse than dying. So if they added even some dark humor here and there, it would have stuck out like a sore thumb, so thank God they didn't do that. 2. Some people apparently found the story to be non-existent throughout the game, which sounded ridiculous to me at first, because I think they were confused between a short length and absence. And number 3, after 4 playthroughs, which felt more disturbing each time by the way, I understood that there's a lot of subtext that exists in this story. It's not just about Max and his journey, because there was a ton of social and psychological commentary along with a dissection of the true nature of humans and how good and evil most of the times depends upon the situation, and more such mind-blowing and thought-provoking subjects. With all that being said, let's head over to the third and final facet of this holy trinity that makes Mad Max a Game of the Year nomination worthy outing: the plot. A much needed reminder, major spoilers ahead. So if you don't want the story spoiled, please head over to the next chapter. Ready? 3, 2, 1, let's go. So here's the story in a rather large nutshell. As I mentioned before, there's a brief 45-second intro that tells us what happened to Max's world. It points to nothing in particular, but we can say for certain that it was a combination of many disasters that rendered the earth barren. We are then thrusted into present day, where we see Max being chased down by war boys while he's on his way to a place he calls the Plains of Silence, who want to take his car and weapons and maybe even eat him. But the road warrior, being the savage he is able to incapacitate many of the enemies before being overwhelmed by numbers and being left for dead. But the fighter in him doesn't let him give up, and he climbs aboard Scabrous Scrotus's Warwick the Land Mover, where we see a duel ensue between Max and the Behemoth, who unleashes his hound upon the road warrior, but Max fights it off, so Scrotus throws the dog out in disgust. And it's during this time that Max severely injures Scrotus by putting a chainsaw right through his skull. But Scrotus is able to throw Max off his rig before collapsing to his injuries, at which point I was pretty sure that the big guy was dead. But Max befriends the doggo, at which point he starts over from scratch. Having lost his car, weapons, and even his clothes, Max looks around for any supplies, and while doing so comes across Chum Bucket, who's about to eat the dog. But Max saves it from becoming puppy steak, at which time Chum recognizes Max from his fight with Lord Scrotus, which he witnessed through his binoculars, and speaks of his dream where he saw a machine of great power and a man who drives it, and hence he starts calling Max Saint. The two then fix up Chum's old buggy and then head over to his hideout, which is in a large ship in the middle of nowhere. There they gather their thoughts, restock on ammunition and supplies, and take the chassis of the Magnum Opus, the grand car that Chum's building, and go into Buzzard territory to acquire a car body. After snatching that from the savage desert men, Chum and Max go back to his hideout where they're attacked by Stank Gum, Scrotus' deadliest underling, and his crew who destroy the shelter. Max and Chum are able to escape with the Magnum Opus, but facing a serious lack of supplies and a safe place to take refuge, they turn to Jeet, a warlord who's trying to take control of a certain territory in the wasteland from Lord Scrotus. So they reckon that the enemy of their enemy is their friend, and also since Chum had a few dealings with the man in the past, the two go over to his stronghold and form an alliance. They then go over to Gutgash's garrison in search of more parts, where Max suddenly comes across a beautiful woman who has a child with her and is locked up in a cage named Hope. She starts pointing Max to a few hidden treasures in order to gain his favor, but a few days later she escapes from captivity. Max then discovers that a big gate called the Jaw is protecting the passage to Gastown, and upgrades his car and weaponry in order to break through the fortification. And after they do, Max and Chum make their way to Pink Eye, a woman with legendary automobile skills, to finally build a car worthy of the big Gastown race, which Max surmises is the best way to get to Scrotus. But upon reaching the fortress, they discover that it's been attacked by Stank Gum and his minions who are on the verge of killing the woman. Chum makes Max realize the worth of Pink Eye as an ally, so he rushes in to save her neck, but there he sees Hope being held as a prisoner by Stank Gum. Max fights off Gum's men and saves the day for Pink Eye, who in turn allows him to take refuge in her stronghold. Up until this point, the story mostly just introduces the principal characters to you and makes you explore the wasteland. So I was about 10 hours into the game and assumed that it's just more of the same stuff up ahead. But to my surprise, the best was yet to come. Max finally upgrades his rig to the mega race worthy levels and heads over to Gastown. There he meets Hope once again, who's alone this time around, but is still trying to get on Max's good side. Max makes it abundantly clear to her that he's not really the gratuitous kind, but she still persists on giving him locations of trinkets for unclear reasons. And there he meets up with the Outcrier, basically the keeper of the races combinedly called the Blood and Guts Circuit. He agrees to try out Max's skills in the preliminary leagues first, but seeing that the man will not settle for anything less than the ultimate championship, the Outcrier agrees to allocate him a spot for a favor, the job being the retrieval of some merchandise from the terror-inducing Underdunes, the infamous Buzzard territory that even the dastardly Gastowners stay clear of. Max agrees to do the job and sets sail to the place with Chum, and when they reach the spot, they discover that it's an abandoned airport that's now buried under an ocean of sand with booby traps and danger at every corner. I loved how they've designed and portrayed the buzzards in this game. They don't speak, don't show their face, are always wearing a weird gas mask, and have a terrifying red glowing pair of eyes, which is sometimes the only way of identifying where they are in pitch black places. Max leaves the Magnum Opus to retrieve the merchandise on foot, but is trapped in a room by the buzzards who corner and outnumber Max, but he's able to stave them off and escape the place along with Chum and Opus in one piece. The design of the entire Underdune Buzzard territory is marvelous. It's claustrophobic, suffocating, dark, demolished, petrifying. Every goddamn thing you'd expect the lair of some psychopaths to be. And after escaping this hellhole, Max goes back to the Outcrier, who's shocked that he survived the Underdunes, but sticks to his promise of placing Max in the big race. But to be in it, he needs a companion, a fighter to be precise, who's authorized to be in the Blood and Guts Circuit. So Max goes to the Crow Dazzle in search for a partner, and there he finds Tenderloin, a woman who's a drug addict and under the debt of Crow. But with no options left, Max decides to race for Crow, and in turn Crow agrees to waive her off her debt. The Road Warrior wins, obviously, and Tenderloin gets herself cleaned up. Well, I'm strictly talking about Wasteland standards, so yeah. And then the big race commences. Max and Loin against a horde of gearheads and the champion Stangum, who drives a massive Warwick with the V8 engine that Max and Chum have been eyeing for some time now. But the Outcrier decides to raise the stakes by placing a ticking time bomb in Max's car and chains him to the steering wheel so he can't escape. And after a pretty tough to beat race, Max wins, but the next trial is partner versus partner. Essentially Max versus Tenderloin. This really shed a ton of light on how savage and cutthroat the Wasteland is. Alliances are forcefully broken here, people have to kill their loved ones in order to survive, and it doesn't get better, or worse rather, than having to murder the ally that you just won a race with. It also shows us how Gastown and Scrotus in particular maintain supremacy in the region by not allowing any other clans to form up, which could be a potential threat in the future, a genius bit of detail. They're thrown in a cage and the fight ensues, but Max is able to take Tenderloin down and becomes the new big champion. And as a reward, he gets Stangum's Warwick with the V8 engine and Hope, who suddenly has a sense of optimism as she has seen some good in Max. But to greet the champion comes down scabrous Scrotus from his Tower of Doom, who still has a part of the chainsaw welded to his skull in order to avoid fatal brain damage. And when he's about to raise Max's hand in victory, Scrotus recognizes the man who almost killed him and tries to avenge his ruination. A big fight ensues with the entirety of the Gastown army trying to slaughter Max to please their lord and master Scrotus. Meanwhile, Stangum, the disgraced former champion, fatally wounds Max with a crossbow, and Scrotus kicks him down into the abyss. I honestly thought this was the big boss fight and the finale, but to my pleasant surprise, it wasn't. Hope saves Max from certain death, and while she's dragging his carcass to the doctor, who they fittingly call the organic mechanic, she discloses her agenda, which is the rescue of her daughter Glory. But Max, even in his fugue state, denies her request. And when he's being reluctantly operated on by the dog, there comes what could low-key be the most emotionally charged scene in the entire game. Max begins to dream, where he sees Dinky D, the dog he befriended, with a human body and a dog's head, and Chumbucket, who point out how Max is outright afraid of letting people close to him because of all those he lost. He then sees Hope walking towards him, calling him husband and saying he'll save them this time around. And the dog-headed Therianthrope begins officiating their marriage. Max puts the ring on Hope and embraces her lovingly, and they begin to dance, when the world around them just goes kaboom. This scene told us a myriad of things, like how deep down Max is still very humane and craves real relationships like friendship and marriage. He's clearly begun to care about Chum and the dog and considers them friends, but is too afraid to let them close. It also showed us that Max is almost in love with Hope, who reminds him of his own wife, who was taken from him, and the man from the bottom of his heart wants to feel whole again, and subconsciously views this opportunity as chance at redemption, as he wasn't able to save his family back in the day. This made me root for Max more than ever and made me want to see him save Glory, marry Hope, and finally feel complete once again. Emotional investment in any story arc is paramount to make the conclusion thrilling and unforgettable, and this scene got me hooked for the last act. Max wakes up and leaves the doctor's lair to find the magnum opus in Chum, who's still at Gastown, and the two make their way to the nearest ally stronghold of Deep Frio, where Hope tries to win over Max's trust by giving him the locations of more treasure. But unsatisfied that he wasn't able to procure the Warwick with the V8 engine, Max goes back to Gastown's underbelly to get what he came for in the first place. There he comes across Hope once again, who shows him the way to the prize, expecting that he'll have a change of heart and finally agree to help her. Max steals the big chief and drives it over to Deep Fear's stronghold, where Chum is ecstatic about being able to fit the V8 engine into the magnum opus and finally accomplish his mission. And right after it's done, when Max is about to leave for the plains of silence, he's stopped by Hope, who pleads with him to save his daughter. Max initially denies her requests, but that little bit of humanity that's still left in him doesn't allow him to let a child die in the middle of nowhere. So he finally agrees to return the favor, and it's at this time, probably the only time in the game, where Max tells us his name.
Max. My name is Max.
Hope gets emotional and kisses Max, which almost terrifies him. So he pushes her away and sets sail to the Underdunes, which was Glory's last known location. And when he reaches the spot, he sees that the old man who was looking after Glory is dead, and deduces that Glory was abducted by the buzzards. Fearing the worst, he rushes over to the abandoned airport once again, despite Chum's repeated pleas against going there. And when they go deep into the buzzard territory, Max goes on foot to search for Glory, but Chum, fearing for his, and more than that for the safety of the magnum opus, abandons Max and flees the scene with the car. Shocked at the turn of events, Max continues to search for the child and finally finds her, but has no vehicle to escape. Then suddenly a horde of buzzards attack Max along with the top dog who arrives in a car. Max defeats them, rescues Glory and returns to Deep Freer's citadel, but is unable to locate Chum. Furious at his betrayal, Max leaves for the abandoned ship where Chum once resided, despite Hope's repeated pleas for him to stay with her and Glory. There is a brief moment where we see Max even consider the action, but his vengeful side takes over and he leaves. When he reaches the ruined hideout, he finds Chum tortured and broken by Scrotus and Stangum, and while the underling is still there, the big guy is gone. Max defeats Stangum and his war boys, and when he's about to leave with Chum and the Opus, Stangum reveals that Scrotus went to pay Deep Freer a visit, as Chum had revealed how Max cares about Hope and her daughter Glory. Horrified at what might have happened, Max runs Stangum over and speeds towards Deep Freer's citadel, and throughout the entire way, Chum repeatedly apologizes to Max and tries to make amends, but the Road Warrior does not utter a single word. This was powerful stuff, as it shows us how Max is buried under a myriad of emotions. The feeling of betrayal from Chum, who he considered a friend deep down, the outright guilt at leaving Hope and Glory for vengeance, and horror, since he's at the same crossroads once again, where all he cares about might be lost. And when Max and Chum reach the stronghold, they are shocked. The people inhabiting the place are dead, Freer is badly hurt, Hope is hung to her death mercilessly, and Glory lies on the floor tortured. Max rushes to Glory in hopes that she's still alive. She does briefly open her eyes and talks to Max, but her little fragile body had experienced too much pain, so she passes away in Max's arms. That almost gave a deja vu feel, because what happened once is happening again, and Max, who was already teetering at the edge of sanity, completely loses his mind. He moans and is broken in all ways, but his vengeance keeps him going. Max tracks down Scrotus and his convoy and outright attacks them. One by one, he takes down vehicles of Scrotus's war party, and once they're all down, he makes a charge at the land mover and almost manages to push it off a cliff. But the massive war rig is barely hanging on by a thread, and all this while he keeps hearing Hope and Glory's voices in his head, telling him to avenge their gruesome deaths. Max decides to ram the rig with the magnum opus, but Chum revolts by sitting on the bonnet of the opus, hoping Max would spare the car, but the Road Warrior, who's in full mad zone at this time, doesn't give a and rams the car with Chum on it, destroying the car and killing the hunchback with it. This left me shocked because I did not see it coming. I never thought Max would be pushed to the point where he would kill Chumbucket mercilessly, but the storyline was just so good, it's perfectly justified. And right when the rig is about to fall off the cliff, Scrotus along with the war boy drives out the back in Max's Interceptor. And then the final boss battle ensues, where Max uses the thundersticks lying around to finally take down his own car and severely injure Scrotus. But the mountainous doesn't die here and fights Max, but the Road Warrior, who's had enough of this evil warlord, rips the chainsaw head out of his skull, which finally kills the son of a bitch. But having lost everything he had, Max gets back in the Interceptor, pulls out a picture of his long lost family and drives off, hopeless and broken once again. The sheer weight of the tragedy of this game is overwhelming. In this regard, it definitely rivaled the movie. In my humble opinion, even outmatched it. Because games always have more time for the story to evolve and draw the players into the world. Plus the fact that we're the ones that have control over the gameplay makes one feel more invested, as our actions have an immediate reaction. And as far as the story goes, this one was mind-blowing. Could it have been better? Well, arguably yeah, but for me, it was in the sweet spot, which left me craving for more while being satisfied and heartbroken at the same time. And now for an aspect that really went under the radar, the gameplay. I can understand why. It isn't your typical fast-paced action-adventure game where the frantic speed gives you no breathing space, and despite the fast travel being a thing, the game really makes you drive a lot. But then again, it's a game that's based on the Road Warrior, so if it wasn't vehicle heavy, I would have been taken aback. So let's talk about that first. There's a ton of vehicular warfare in this game. Not only do wastelanders attack you randomly all the time, from the first sequence to the very last, it's about driving to your destiny. And it's in no way, shape or form boring. I love the fact that they've placed emphasis on your car, because if you don't take care of it, refuel, yes, the car requires you to find and fill her up with gasoline. Upgrade it from time to time and keep it repaired. Not only can you not complete many of the storyline missions, you'll most likely be killed multiple times throughout the runtime. Speaking of repairs and maintenance, Chum perpetually accompanies Max in the Opus and takes better care of it than most people do of their wives or girlfriends or both. And a great gameplay element was that if the Opus is damaged in combat, you can order Chum to repair the car or quick repair it yourself, which will cost you a good number of scraps to get it going again. The reason it's good is because it forces the player to be careful about how much damage they absorb and plan out their attacks. On top of that, there's the Sideburners upgrade, which allows the Opus to spit fire on both sides to cause massive damage to the enemy vehicles. But it uses a big chunk of fuel, so although it's a powerful tool, it's one that requires some restraint or you risk being stranded. You can, however, carry one fuel can at a time, and upgrading Max's abilities through the Griffer tokens allows him to drive further while consuming less fuel, but that doesn't add much time to the Sideburners' capacity. And since enemy vehicles range from regular scout cars to full-blown armored beasts, it's always handy to have access to as many weapons as possible. Another great addition was the sniper rifle, which can only be used when in the car to take out enemies, and when Max goes to the back and takes charge of the sniper, Chum switches positions with him, and even then you can drive the Opus but at a very slow pace. The car really does justice to the moniker Magnum Opus, as it's the ultimate creation. The sheer number of customizations and variations the car has is stunning. Every part, the engine, armor, the ramming grille, tires, exhaust, rims, the body, suspension, they can all be upgraded. But the great thing is, the most expensive part of the lot isn't always the best for all situations, because they've taken real world physics into account, like the weight of a massive ramming grille or cast iron armor, which realistically would slow the vehicle down. This can somewhat be fixed by upgrading the engine or tires, which might or might not mess with the car's stability, so you gotta be real careful to pick out parts. In essence, you can tailor it to fit any requirement, be it for more speed, better stability, defense, or all-out war. Which means the car can be one thing or all things at once in different levels. There are also preset mods called the Archangels, which can be selected from the garage menu to instantly tune your car to current need. Plus, the Magnum Opus is fitted with a harpoon, which can be launched to take down objects in an environment like gates, blockades, and the aforementioned scarecrows. It can also be used to pull tires and armor off of enemy vehicles and outright impale the guys and yank them out of their cars. There's also the Thunderpoon, basically harpoons that explode on impact. There's also a nitrous system, which is actually pretty different than every other game that I've played. Instead of supplying the car with added speed for as long as you hold the button or it requires recharge, we see the nitros give you one single boost, which might allow you to take over enemy vehicles, but if your target is to ram them from the side, you have to be really meticulous as to when you use the boost. And then there's the hand-to-hand combat, which although simple is still vastly enjoyable. It's your basic attack, parry, and counter system, just like the Arkham series, but has its own Mad Max twist. For example, you can shiv your enemies, charge them, use weapons that are lying around like a steel pipe, a mace, or thundersticks, which are same as the thunderpoons but on foot, or just shoot them in the head with your shotgun, which always used to be my last option, as shotgun shells are bloody difficult to find. Max can also upgrade his armor and knuckle dusters, which allow for better melee abilities. The Road Warrior's look can be customized greatly. You can choose between a stubble to a full-grown beard, short or long hair, bandanas, goggles, or combinations of available options to customize as you so desire. And almost all the abilities can be upgraded with Griffer, like dealing more damage, extracting more water from drip collectors, being able to gain more health when you eat food, well, if you consider that food, and Max's legend, which kind of indicates how famous he is across the wasteland, which in turn unlocks more upgrades to his arsenal and vehicle. There are 10 levels to Max's legend, which starts at the roadkill rank and ends at, you guessed it right, the road warrior. Obviously, and keeping an eye on your health bar is always a good idea, because if you're accustomed to today's games where health auto regenerates after a fight, you'll be in for an ugly surprise when Max, who although is quite formidable, collapses after absorbing a few blows and you have to start the mission all over again. So it really forces you to look for regenerative sources and not just run around places aimlessly. The many enemy types surely make it interesting to say the least. There are regular Half-Life war boys, maniacal shiv slingers, shield and mace bearing combatants, and the diabolical top dogs, who can crush Max in just a few strikes. I would however like to point out how the same formula works to defeat every single top dog: evade a weapon strike and then attack, which did get slightly repetitive by the time I went through a few of them, but overall it was a once in a lifetime experience, which turned out to be 4 times for me. Now about the missions. Although the main ones are designed in unique and creative ways, the side quests can get a bit repetitive, but here's what works in its favor: maze-like quality of the locations. No matter where you choose to go, whether it's a massive oil transfer camp, a top dog's lair, a Stangum stronghold, or just another scavenging location, all sites have a unique full circle quality. Meaning no matter which one of the many possible routes you take, you always end up where you need to go, which applies to pretty much all the places. And the places have stunning views like creepy bridges, massive scrapyards, enormous gates protected by hellfire, top dog thrones which seem insane. And in addition to that, there's a generous amount of side activities like collecting scrap, destroying Scrotus insignias, and acquiring the aforementioned random photos from the world before, aka historic relics. It really was a pleasant surprise, and the design team deserves serious praise for it. Because even though there are about 8 to 10 top dog bases, 15 to 20 oil transfer camps, 10 to 15 pumping grounds, and over 100 scavenging locations, they all feel unique and fresh, which manages to keep you on your toes. And liberating these places from Scrotus' control allows friendly forces to occupy them, who then supply you scrap on a regular basis. The Wastelanders and ally clan members often give Max valuable info about enemy camps, like secret entrances or locations of important car or project paths, which I thought was a great touch. And Max wouldn't be much of a road warrior without some mind-blowing war party sequences, the likes of which we saw in Fury Road, aka attacking convoys, where we see Max and Chum go against war parties carrying resources and, most importantly, hood ornaments that are revered and feared across the land and add powerful abilities to the magnum opus. I gotta admit, this aspect wasn't as spectacular as the ones we saw in the movie. The scale wasn't nearly at the level, the numbers were decent at best, and it never felt like an impossible task. But then again, the whole 2015 film was pretty much based on that one sequence, so I wouldn't give the game flack if it didn't outmatch the film in this regard. There's also car stunts, aka powering the magnum opus of ramps across the wasteland for a stunning view, which in turn helps Max's legend grow. Also spread across the wasteland are outposts, which act as fast travel locations and have hot air balloons that can take Max to great heights from which he can scout the area. Now let's talk about the revered Crow Dazzle races, which almost had a sacred feel to them, and it's mainly because of how the Wastelanders talk about it with such reverence. It further established how machines are now gods in this post-apocalyptic world. The races themselves are primarily formed of scatter runs, a race where you either beat your opponents to finish or just kill them all before time runs out, the Barrel Bash, where you have to clear checkpoints by ramming into burning oil barrels and cross the finish line in given time, and last and unfortunately the least, I'm calling it that because it's been discontinued for some time now, so I wasn't able to experience it, the Opus Wars, which I found out was an online race against the best times across the world. It's a crying shame that this beautiful game is dying. In fact, it's almost dead. Another addition that elevates the world building was the Stronghold projects, where Max finds important parts across the map and builds storages for basic needs such as food, water, fuel, and ammunition in ally strongholds, which not only helps Max be stocked and topped
and locked, or stocked, topped. It's
at all times. It does take some time for the stockpile to regenerate, but in the end, life gets a tad bit easier in the wasteland. And now let's talk about the main mission designs, which I gotta say was absolutely stunning. From the very beginning, they make it about a car, and the creators have done complete justice to the series, as it's mostly based on cars, and more cars. So the entire time a main mission is taking place, the magnum opus plays just as important a part as Max or Chum, which was brilliant. And since I've already expanded on the story in detail, there's no point in me delving deep here, as the plot is the real hero. I honestly expected a rock and guitar heavy background score in the game, especially because of the crazy Doof Warriors portrayal by Iota in Fury Road, which was disturbing and enigmatic at the same time. But to my surprise, it was rather subtle, dystopian opera heavy, and although it did have shades of Fury Road's music, in no shape or form did it sound like a rip-off. But this is another area where Fury Road was ahead. I mean, it's not really a comparison, which I might end up doing in the future, but since they both came out just a few months apart, it was only natural that I subconsciously compared the two. So I reckoned I might as well do it in the video. And the soundtracks, although great while in full Road Warrior mode, do not possess the ability to stand out enough for you to go and search for them even after the game is through. But it did elevate the atmosphere greatly, and there was no unnecessary pivots in music design, so that's always a plus. Initially, my heart told me that this game was way ahead of its time, but when my brain took over, I realized that it's not. What it actually is a timeless classic. I might be speaking off of optimism here, but I firmly believe that this game has its best days ahead of it. Highly unlikely, you might say, but when, not if, another Mad Max movie comes out, and seeing how George Miller is an absolute genius and one of the primary consultants for the game, it's safe to say that it'll be a massive hit, and that could give this criminally underrated game a much needed boost and some goddamn recognition. As I'm sure you have noticed throughout the entire video, the most captivating aspects of the game are not the surface ones, like say the visuals or gameplay, which no matter how good they are always bound to be outdated in a few years at most, but the core values instead, like the story, world building and character development, which will always keep the players coming back for one more run. And there are a few rare instances where gameplay makes the game timeless, but more often than not it doesn't happen in the action-adventure genre. If you can name such a game, please tell me in the comment section below. For example, people don't go back and play games like Arkham Asylum or Assassin's Creed 2 so that they can experience the gameplay once again. Maybe a small margin of the players, and maybe parts of it, because it's already been upgraded to another level, so it's most likely for the fundamentals like stories or characters. And that is exactly what Mad Max's biggest strength is. So if you're a game fanatic and have $20 in your pocket, I strongly suggest you buy and play this exquisitely crafted game. And to anybody who asks me why, just watch the video. I've tried my best to give you all the reasons as to why you should. There is a silver lining though, as I've seen news of a sequel that might just happen yet. And if it does, I'm buying it on day one. If I have the cash. Or I'll buy it ASAP, that's right. All joking aside, games like Mad Max deserve support, and I'm all for shedding spotlight on ventures that have absolutely earned it. So this was my in-depth review of Mad Max 2015, the game. Tell me in the comment section below if you've played it, liked or disliked it, or maybe had it on your radar and were thinking of what to do. Also tell me what you thought of the video and my thorough analysis of the game. That's it for today guys, until next time, stay safe, stay strong and stay tuned. It's your boy VZX signing out.